Studies on Hysteria, NRO, page 28. Uh, would anyone like to read or have any questions on this case?
I will read. I will need a minute to get properly starting. I'm still on the phone and the laptop has not started.
So let me start with the first paragraph.
Sir,
In spite of her euphoria at night, her psychical condition deteriorated steadily. So we see here euphoria at night, a strange kind of thing where the manic component is very, very time driven. Strong suicidal impulses appeared, which made it inadvisable for her to continue living on the third floor. So we are almost looking at a bipolar kind of situation. At night, there is euphoria and coupled with strong suicidal tendencies. Against her will, therefore, she was transferred to a country house in the neighborhood of Vienna. I had never threatened her with this removal from her home, which she regarded with horror. But she herself had, without saying so, expected and dreaded it. So we see very strong attachment to the home where she was living. And this opens up this whole area of non-human attachments and separation anxiety linked to non-human attachments. Meaning, one may be attached not only to human beings, but also to places, to homes, to hostels, and one may find it difficult to move out of it. Uh, a couple of days back, I got a call, an emergency call at night, precisely because of this. Somebody had to go out of India to attend the social function, and the separation anxiety kicked in. And the person felt extremely anxious and called me at night and wanted to talk to me. Of course, we talked for quite a long time, took almost an hour, 1.5 hours actually. And then the anxiety subsided. But this can be true for many people that the attachments are thrown all around, even to non human entities. On this, there is a discussion on my YouTube channel called Non Human Attachments, which includes attachment to animals, pets, attachment to the home, attachment to the city you live in, attachment to hostels, and so on. So we see that also at play. This event made it clear once more how much the effect of anxiety dominated her psychical disorder. Just as after her father's death, a calmer condition had set in, so now, when what she feared had actually taken place, she once more became calmer. It's like the anxiety of something is worse than that thing itself. Many people have it while learning to drive, that the anxiety that they will smash against something is so high that they choose an innocent object to smash against, and in a way that calms the anxiety, which is worse than the actual event. Nevertheless, the move was immediately followed by 3 days and nights completely without sleep or nourishment. So we see here perhaps a manic episode or a depressive episode, but the same bipolar thing continues, either the upper cycle or the lower cycle. By numerous attempts at suicide, so it looks like the lower cycle. Though so long as she was in the garden, these were not dangerous. By smashing windows and so on, and by hallucinations unaccompanied by absences, which she was able to distinguish easily from other hallucinations. So she's experiencing two kinds of hallucinations: hallucinations with absences, and hallucinations where something positive is engaged with. After this, she grew quieter, let the nurse feed her, and even took chloral at night. So it was like the heightening of the difficulty and then remission of it. Anyone would like to continue further? Yeah, please.
Yeah. Before continuing my account of the case, I must go back once more and describe one of its peculiarities, which I have hitherto mentioned only in passing. I have already said that throughout the illness up to this point, the patient fell into a somnolent state every afternoon, and that after sunset, this period passed into a deeper sleep, clouds. It seems plausible to attribute this regular sequence of events merely to her experience while she was nursing her father, which she had taken to do for several months. During the nights, she had watched by the patient's bedside or had been awake anxiously listening till the morning. In the afternoon, she had lain down for the short rest, as in the usual habit of nurses. This pattern of walking at night and sleeping in the afternoon seems to have been carried over into her own illness and to have persisted long after the sleep had been replaced by a hypnotic state. After the deep sleep had lasted about an hour, she grew restless, tossed to and fro, and kept repeating, tormenting, tormenting, with her eyes shut all the time. It was also noticed how during her absences in daytime, she was obviously creating some situation or episode to which she gave a clue with a few muttered words. It happened then to begin with accidentally, but later intentionally, that someone near her repeated one of these phrases of hers while she was complaining about the tormenting. She at once joined in and began to paint some situation or tell some story, hesitatingly at first and in her paraphrastic jargon. But the longer she went on, the more fluent she became, till at last she was speaking quite correct German. This applies to the early period before she began talking English only. The stories were always sad, and some of them were very charming, in the style of Hans Andersen's picture book without pictures, and indeed they were probably constructed on that model. As a rule, their starting point or certain situation, central situation, was of a girl anxiously sitting by a sick bed, but she also built up her stories on quite other topics. A few moments after she had finished her narrative, she would wake up, obviously calmed down, or as she called it, gehaglich. During the night, she would again become restless, and in the morning, after a couple of hours' sleep, she was visibly involved in some other set of ideas. If for any reason she was unable to tell me the story during her evening hypnosis, she failed to calm down afterwards, and on the following day, she had to tell me two stories in order for this to happen.
So what we see here is uh, two or three very important things. Difficulty of going to a deep sleep for a long time. And this is true of many people who have difficulty going to sleep. And there can be many reasons for why one does not go to sleep. Quite a common uh, feature of depression. Also, quite a common feature of mania. So, in depression, usually when we see disturbed sleep, the general rule is if it is too much of sleep, probably we are dealing with sadness or sadness driven depression. And if it is too little sleep, then probably we are dealing with anger driven depression. And anger driven depression will also have some repetitive thinking. It may not go to the level of obsession, but there definitely will be repetition. Now, what she is complaining is partly that when she goes into sleep, and this is one of the reasons why some people are afraid to go to sleep in a deep sleep mode, because the fear is if they really go in, they will encounter material which is very difficult to bear. So in a way, they keep the sleep shallow to avoid encountering very difficult material. And if they encounter, after they wake up, they see some aggravation of the symptom, whatever symptom they have. And if they are able to go to deep sleep without encountering that material, somehow bypassing it, then they wake up very refreshed. But this is very rare for those who have that difficult material inside to deactivate that material or bypass that material. And therefore, most of the times they find it difficult to go into deep sleep. And it's a consciously avoided activity in order to prevent encountering that material. Second important point which we see in this paragraph is if you speak to her, what she speaks unknowingly, and that connects to her inner mind, the unconscious mind, she starts elaborating upon it, and then the cure somehow happens. She comes back to speaking German, which is what her real mother tongue used to be. So it is like when you join in into the story, which the person is babbling incoherently, right? The person somehow gets a container, gets a safe place to really complete the story, articulate it, and that somehow produces some sort of healing.
Shall I read?
Yeah, please.
Thank you, Madhusudanji. I took time to log on. The essential features of this phenomenon, the mounting up and intensification of her absences into her auto-hypnosis in the evening, the effect of the products of her imagination as psychical stimuli, and the easing and removal of her state of stimulation when she gave utterances to them in her hypnosis remained constant throughout the whole 18 months during which she was under observation.
Right. So what we see is this uh, auto hypnosis type of situation she was going into. It's a strange kind of a state of absences. Now, uh, it is slightly different from depersonalization and derealization because what we are looking at here is she being absent, almost like being catatonic in the sense of awareness. It's a very different kind of state than depersonalization or derealization. And she just goes into her absence in a way.
Shall I go ahead?
Yeah, please.
The stories naturally became still more tragic after her father's death. It was not, however, until the deterioration of her mental condition, which followed when her state of somnambulism was forcibly broken into in the way already described, that her evening narratives ceased to have the character of more or less freely created poetical compositions and changed into a string of frightful and terrifying hallucinations. It was already possible to arrive at these from the patient's behavior during the day. I have already described how completely her mind was relieved when, shaking with fear and horror, she had reproduced these frightful images and given verbal utterances to them.
So this is very important actually. And if you try to explain this paragraph, it goes actually beyond Freud. Because what we are encountering here is something that Klein had gone deeper into. So let us first look at the way Freudian approach to it would be, and then look at the Kleinian approach. For Freud, it was clear that what was very difficult to articulate, when you provide a safe place to articulate and you join into the story, no matter how absurd the story looks, slowly the story completes and the person feels much better. And that is the way the hallucinations go down. That when she had hallucinations and she talked something absurd or disjointed, you joined in and allowed her to complete the story. And this created two things. One, initially, it changed the way articulation was made, the content of it, from fairy tales to something very frightening, which means something very frightening was being avoided by some sort of reaction formation mechanism by going into the opposite of it. Just as many times in mania we see that the manic episode is actually an avoidance of sadness having become active. That when too much sadness becomes active and the capacity to mourn it or face it is not there, the system uses the mechanism of mania, which goes exactly into the opposite. So higher the intensity of mania, higher is the sadness that is being avoided. So obviously, when we look at it in bipolar 1, the amount of sadness will be much higher bottled up than in bipolar 2. Because the upper cycle will be much weaker in bipolar 2 compared to bipolar 1. So from our point of view, what we are seeing here is that initially the difficult material were avoided by getting into its opposite. The terrifying things were converted into fairy tales. Just the opposite of it. The more cute and beautiful the fairy tales look, the more terrifying material it's trying to avoid. So in the language of defenses, we would call it the defense of reaction formation. Doing the opposite. That if you are too sad, you show happiness. Right? If you are too angry with somebody, you show friendship. And unconsciously, I mean, consciously it would be politicking or manipulation, but unconsciously it's defensive one. So what we have here is difficult material avoided by going to its opposite. And when you provide a safe place, you engage with her, she becomes capable of dealing with this material along with you. And now she does not have to use the defense of reaction formation. She can deal with the material as it is, and as it is, the terrifying material comes up. And as it comes up, there is a temporary aggravation. Because you're no longer avoiding it using defenses. You unconsciously know now you have the capacity and support outside to deal with it. And the mind decides to deal with it. And then it is a temporary aggravation as you deal with it. And then remission happens and you feel much better. So this is one way, the Freudian way of looking at it. The Kleinian way will be that what is happening is the split. We'll come to it later when we do Klein. But the idea will be that you move from an all good object to an all bad object. And what you are looking at is a split open where extremely positive projections are happening, extreme negative projections are happening. When you go to the positive pole, you deny all the terrible material and you just be in the ecstasy of the positive pole. And then you go to the negative pole and you deny all the ecstasy of the positive pole and you just be with the negative pole, all the terrifying material. And there the idea will be integration. How do you get out of this binary bipolarity and get into integration? We'll do it later, but for the moment, we can just be with it that there was negative material avoided using defenses by going into something very positive. And when the capacity is built up inside and support is found outside, one is ready to deal with the material. It comes up temporary aggravation and then remission. And this is true of many types of healing. You see this temporary aggravation and then healing. You see in psychotherapy, you see in homeopathy, you also see it in Ayurveda. So it seems to be some more generic phenomena at work, which is displaying in various modes of healing in different contexts. Yeah. Let us go ahead.
Should I?
Yeah, please.
While she was in the country, when I was unable to pay her daily visits, the situation developed as follows. I used to visit her in the evening, when I knew I should bring when I knew I should find her in her hypnosis, and I then relieved her of the whole stock of imaginative products which she had accumulated since my last visit. It was essential that this should be effected completely if good results were to follow. When this was done, she became perfectly calm, and next day she would be agreeable, easy to manage, industrious, and even cheerful. But on the second day, she would be increasingly moody, contrary, and unpleasant, and this would become still more marked on the third day. When she was like this, it was not always easy to get her to talk, even in her hypnosis. She aptly described this procedure, speaking seriously, as a talking cure, while she referred to it jokingly as chimney sweeping. She knew that after she had given utterance to her hallucinations, she would lose all her obstinacy and what she described as her energy. And when, after some comparatively long interval, she was in a bad temper, she would refuse to talk, and I was obliged to overcome her unwillingness by urging and pleading, and using devices such as repeating a formula with which she was in the habit of introducing her stories. But she would never begin to talk until she had satisfied herself of my identity by carefully feeling my hands. On those nights on which she had not been calmed by verbal utterance, it was necessary to fall back upon chloral. I had tried it on a few earlier occasions, but I was obliged to give her 5 grams, and sleep was preceded by a state of intoxication which lasted for some hours. When I was present, this state was euphoric, but in my absence it was highly disagreeable and characterized by anxiety as well as excitement. It may be remarked, it may be remarked incidentally that this severe state of intoxication made no difference to her contractures. I had been able to avoid the use of narcotics, since the verbal utterance of her hallucinations calmed her, even though it might not induce sleep. But when she was in the country, the nights on which she had not obtained hypnotic relief were so unbearable, it was necessary to have recourse to chloral, where it became possible gradually to reduce the dose.
Yeah. So, two important points come up in this paragraph. One is the relief by talking. The second is the intermittent nature of the cure. And this often is a point in the whole therapy process. That are we in a perpetually maintenance mode? That after the session, the person feels better for some time, and then the difficulty starts again. Like what we see here. That when he talked to her, she felt good, and that day she would peacefully go to sleep, and it would go on for a few days, and then the effect would wear off. It's almost like there is a shelf life of the effect of therapy, and it's a diminishing curve. So, points come up here. One, are we in a perpetually maintenance mode? That till the therapy goes on, it's in control, and once the therapy is stopped, again the florid precipitation of the whole symptom comes. Then it would be just like a diabetic medicine or blood pressure medicine. That all we are doing is maintenance, there is no cure. So there are 2 points here. One, we have to remember the tree of trauma. That we are moving from the leaf to the branch to the trunk to the root. Now, if we don't make that movement, but just limit ourselves to symptom alleviation one after the other, then that movement is not seen. But if we know that finally we have to move to the center, then there is something which is called the fundamental restructuring. Now, fundamental restructuring can happen in two ways. One is there is a cognitive fundamental restructuring, or some core affect is released. Now, when the core affect is released, lasting healing happens and we get out of the maintenance mode. So this is very important. When will we get out of maintenance mode, or is the therapy going to be forever? So Freud wrote a paper on this. We'll take it up. Uh, terminable and interminable. So this is a very important question in case of the therapy process. When do you terminate the therapy? What are the goals of therapy? And how do you terminate the therapy? Do you taper it off? Do you plan from before? Do you go for fixed number of sessions? All of these are questions of uh, the psychoanalytic process being terminable or interminable, and how do you terminate that therapy? So part of it has to do with what are the goals of therapy, and part of it has to do with the process of doing the termination. But the core here is the core affect which is blocked, if that is released, or the core cognitive thing which is in trouble, if that undergoes a restructuring, only then we get out of maintenance mode. Otherwise, we are always in the maintenance mode. And this core restructuring, if it involves capacity building, then it will take even longer, because then we are looking at something apart from cognitive restructuring or affective catharsis. We are looking at a capacity building inside. Now, in this paragraph, we see the same thing again here, that the patient feels very good when the therapist has come, which means at her unconscious level, she is finding a good, reliable, stable object in the therapist. And this is a core requirement in case of capacity building, that you need somebody who you can see as a good, reliable, stable object. And when you see that person for a long time, the unconscious mind initially hesitates, tries to test out the person, but then over a period of time internalizes that person. And when the internalization happens of a good, reliable, stable object, then often it is the right time when the fundamental cure can happen. So the fundamental cure may happen because of a fundamental cognitive restructuring, a fundamental repressed affect catharsis, or a deficit of a good, reliable, stable object being met, or a deficit of containment being met, that you find a good container, that you always had people who were very short tempered, very irritable. Right? They were never composed. They were never soft. They were never composed. So you want somebody whom you can feel safe, and often that does the work. And in some cases, uh, in very difficult cases, the person will use the therapist as a system to process what he can't process. What is the active part of containment? We'll come to it when we do Bion, but these are the ways in which fundamental cure can happen. Until fundamental cure happens, we are in a maintenance mode. Right? So this is what people often say, is it going to be forever? Is therapy for life, or is life for therapy? And obviously, therapy is for life. Life is not for therapy. But we go on till the fundamental cure is attained, and or we are sure that nothing more can be done. We have done our best. This is the limit. So either of the two. But when the fundamental cure happens, either of this will happen. Yeah. Please.
The persisting somnambulism did not return. But on the other hand, the alternation between two states of consciousness persisted. She used to hallucinate in the middle of a conversation, run off, start climbing up a tree, etc. If one caught hold of her, she would very quickly take up her interrupted sentence without knowing anything about what had happened in the interval. All these hallucinations, however, came up and were reported on in her hypnosis.
Right. So we see here the healing has started in a way. Now, they are not still able to make out because we're in the early days of psychoanalysis. They are not exactly able to make out still how the healing has happened, but the healing has happened. And what is clear is it has not happened completely. It has happened on one particular point of the whole difficulty. Rest of the difficulty still persists. But it has happened not because of any medication. It has happened essentially by talking to her. So this is very important that they have not used a drug-induced cure. They have only talked to her in a particular way. And that has started giving results in a small way. On one point of somnambulism, she has improved. So let us go ahead.
Her condition improved on the whole. She took nourishment without difficulty and allowed the nurse to feed her, except that she asked for bread but rejected it the moment it touched her lips. The paralytic contracture of the leg diminished greatly. There was also an improvement in her power of judgment, and she became much attached to my friend Dr. B, the physician who visited her. She derived much benefit from a Newfoundland dog which was given to her and of which she was passionately fond. On one occasion, though, her pet made an attack on a cat, and it was splendid to see the way in which the frail girl seized a whip in her left hand and beat off the huge beast with it to rescue his victim. Later, she looked after some poor sick people, and this helped her greatly.
So we see here something very important of the attachment point. That after she could practice her attachment safely with the therapist, she finds it safer to attach to somebody else, and that is a pet. So this whole attachment aspect of the psyche is slowly opening up. And that is very important because I often say one of the core difficulties in many people is not having good, reliable, stable attachments. So it is like a stock market portfolio that if you invest in stock market, you don't invest everything in one script. You will invest in 4 or 5 different scripts. So similarly, if you don't put all the attachment in one person, but you distribute your attachment in 4 or 5 safe people, it becomes a very safe portfolio. In the sense, if one person goes, does not create a crisis. But if you invest all the attachment in one person and that person moves out, it's a crisis. And this is the typical dynamic of dependent personality disorder. That in dependent personality disorder, they will always invest in only one person, right, and create a crisis for themselves. Because once they have invested everything in one person, then any other person talking to that person creates a triangle and competition. So they won't allow that person to talk to anybody else because they feel anxious and envious. So once they invest everything in one person and he gives attention to anybody else, they feel envious. Right? And the fear of abandonment starts. The fear of defeat in an Oedipal triangle starts. So they try to control that person, and the control is so menacing that the person starts feeling suffocating. Then there are quarrels between the two. And what they did to avoid abandonment actually brings in abandonment. This microcontrol was a tool to avoid abandonment, and that very tool brings in abandonment. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So this is the classical difficulty of dependent personality disorder, that when they are alone, they can't manage loneliness. It's very anxiety provoking, sadness provoking, right? It's demotivating, depression provoking. So they search for somebody. When they search for somebody, they invest everything in that person. Then envy starts, anxiety starts, micro-control starts, then quarrel starts, and then again separation happens. So again, the difficulty of loneliness, the cycle goes on. Right? Loneliness, overinvestment, micro-control, quarrel, loneliness. Again, the cycle. Right? So this is the classical cycle of the dependent personality disorder. But what we are looking here is key. Yeah, so I was saying key. I always tell them the cure for dependent personality disorder is a healthy attachment portfolio. Don't invest in one person, divide it into five people. All the five don't have to be your lovers or friends. You can have one lover, one friend, one teacher, one mentor, one relative, whatever it is. But have a healthy attachment portfolio. Don't risk too much by investing in too few. But as a rule, nobody has yet obeyed what I said. So no dependent personality disorder person, regardless of the knowledge of this, that this is the solution to my suffering, they won't implement the solution. And that brings us to a second point, why this is happening. Why they can't implement the solution and end their suffering. And this will lead us to this whole idea of projection of omnipotence. That they will not be able to distribute attachment in five people because they cannot distribute projection of omnipotence in five people. They project omnipotence only on one person, and therefore everybody else becomes uninteresting. So this omnipotence projection becomes then the core in that dependent difficulty. Right? It's exactly reverse of narcissism. In narcissism, people project omnipotence on oneself, and in dependence, they project it on somebody else. So in narcissism, the self is idealized and the other is de-idealized. And in dependence, the self is de-idealized and the other is idealized. Let us go ahead. It was after I returned.
It was after I returned from a holiday trip which lasted several weeks that I received the most convincing evidence of the pathogenic and exciting effect brought about by the ideational complexes which were produced during her absences or condition secundi, and of the fact that these complexes were these complexes were disposed of by being given verbal expression during hypnosis. During this interval, no talking cure had been carried out, for it was impossible to persuade her to confide what she had to say to anyone but me, not even to Dr. B, to whom she had in other respects become devoted. I found her in a wretched moral state, inert, unamenable, ill tempered, even malicious. It became plain from her evening stories that her imaginative and poetic vein was drying up. What she reported was more and more concerned with her hallucinations, and, for instance, the things that had annoyed her during the past days. These were clothed in imaginative shape, but were merely formulated in stereotyped images rather than elaborated into poetic productions. But the situation only became tolerable after I had arranged for the patient to be brought back to Vienna for a week and evening for a week and evening after evening made her tell me 3 or 5 stories. When I had accomplished this, everything that had accumulated during the weeks of my absence had been worked off. I was only now, it was only now that the former rhythm was re-established. On the day after her giving verbal utterance to her fantasies with PH, to her fantasies, she was amiable and cheerful. On the second day, she was more irritable and less agreeable, and on the third, positively nasty. Her moral state was a function of the time that had elapsed since her last utterance. This was because every one of the spontaneous products of her imagination and every event which had been assimilated in pathological part of her mind persisted as a psychical stimulus until it had been narrated in her hypnosis, after which it completely ceased to operate.
So what we see here is that the state of hypnosis is becoming a state of catharsis. In the hypnotic state, the difficult things which cannot be said or felt, they are being said and they are being felt. It's a kind of an autotherapy. And therefore, if you broaden the word therapy to say, how can therapy happen in the wide sense of the term? Then, of course, we have to say it did not happen only in the therapy room. Any safe person, any insightful or genuinely good person as a friend or as a mentor or anybody can also help us do therapy in the larger sense of the term. And this is what is happening, that in her state of hypnosis, a kind of autotherapy is happening, where although there is no therapist to make an intervention, somehow the catharsis is going on. And this catharsis is helping her feel better. Number one. Number two, uh, very important feelings are being projected onto the therapist. The therapist becomes a good, reliable, stable object. And this later on we will call this transference, that feelings related to X are put onto Y. So feelings related to early life figures, mother, father, or anybody else, are put onto the therapist, what we will call the transference later on. But we are still in the pre-transference era, where Freud is just building up the basics. So what we see here is on D, Dr. Brewer, she has projected a good, reliable, stable object. And these projections are very important, because we will see when we do technique, how to do therapy, how to handle this transference. Number one. And number two, how pure a transference we want. Because few people realize that it is not easy to handle very pure transference. So we have to make a wise judgment how pure a transference you want. And that will dictate how anonymous you want to be, how strict you want to enforce the frame of therapy, and how much self-revelation you want to do. Because the more anonymous you become and stricter you enforce the frame of therapy, more will be the purer form of transference. And everyone is not equipped to really manage transference in therapy. Right? So the rule of thumb is evoke transference that is manageable and evoke transference that is useful. Too strong transferences can lead to difficult situations. We'll see it later after we do the psychosexual development, that when we have too strong an Oedipal transference, it's very difficult to handle. And if we have too strong a pre-Oedipal transference, that's also difficult to handle. And because if you go very deep into it, so transference actually starts the moment the client picks up the call and starts talking to you. It is not that only after the therapy starts and after a few sessions. After a few sessions, it becomes conspicuous. But the transference is always there. And transference happens not only in therapy, it happens with everybody. Right? At the workplace, there is a transference on the boss. In the friend circle, there are transferences. So they happen everywhere. But what we see here is that is one point. The second point is when the therapist talks about the difficulties, talks about the not so rational, almost absurd kind of utterances, she feels relief. And that is very important to engage with whatever is expressed without seeing the rationality of that expression. Because if we just look at the rationality and we dismiss it, or worse, if we attack the non rational, the unconscious feels even more persecuted. It represses even further, and it cannot repress, produces symptoms even worse. So, this is where the therapist being amoral and ready to take interest in every utterance that makes such a difference.
I can read the next one.
Yeah, just we'll go to page 35 now.
Okay.
Yeah, page 35.
An example will show the exhaustive manner in which she accomplished this. It was a regular experience that the patient did not hear when she was spoken to. It was possible to differentiate this passing habit of not hearing as follows. A. Not hearing when someone came in while her thoughts were abstracted. 108 separate detailed instances of this, mentioning the persons and circumstances, often with dates. First instance, not hearing her father come in.
So this is very
B.
important. The
Yeah.
first, the first instance of not hearing the father come in. Right. Yeah, please go on.
B. Not understanding when several people were talking. 27 instances. First instance, her father, once more, and an acquaintance. C. Not hearing when she was alone and directly addressed. 50 instances. Origin, her father having vainly asked her for some wine. D. Deafness brought on by being shaken in a carriage, etc. Uh, should I stop?
Yeah, please go on.
15 instances. Origin having been shaken angrily by her young brother when he caught her one night listening at the sick room door. E. Deafness brought on by fright at a noise. 37 instances. Origin a choking fit of her father's caused by swallowing the wrong way. F. Deafness during deep absence. 12 instances. G. Deafness brought on by listening hard for a long time, so that when she was spoken to, she failed to hear. 54 instances.
So we see here A, B, C. Everywhere the father is involved.
Yeah.
In A, in B, in C, father is involved. In D, younger brother is involved. E, again the father is involved. F, nobody is involved. There is a different story at work. And what we see is the number of instances that the same thing has been repeating over and over again. Yeah, let us go ahead.
Of course, all these episodes were to a great extent identical in so far as they could be traced back to states of abstraction or absences or to fright. But in the patient's memory, they were so clearly differentiated that if she happened to make a mistake in their sequence, she would be obliged to correct herself and put them in the right order. If this was not done, her report came to a standstill. The events she described were so lacking in interest and significance and were told in such detail that there could be no suspicion of their having been invented. Many of these incidents consisted of purely internal experiences and so could not be verified. Others of them, or circumstances attending them, were within the recollection of people in her environment.
So this brings up a very important point of the
She's
sequence in
making
which,
is she making false memories?
yeah, that's where one of the point of this paragraph is that in many cases there is no external confirmation, right? And therefore we are not sure whether what is being reported has actually happened or is there is false reporting. Number one. Number two is that uh, trauma reported actually has happened or is it a false memory? And Freud had both these ideas at different points in time. First, he had this idea of an early life trauma, and then he had this idea of a fantasized trauma that people were making up certain things. And this brings up a very important point that after many years, when we are trying to get in touch with these memories, are we doing rediscovery or are we doing a recreation? So the patient comes to you at 35 and 40, and you are talking about what happened at 4 years of age or 2 years of age, and at that time you go back in memory. So are you doing a rediscovery or are you doing a recreation? That always remains as one of the questions, but most people believe it's largely rediscovery. There can be a small element of recreation, but largely it's a rediscovery. And Freud, after some time, gave up the universality of this idea of this fantasized trauma. It was only for a very short period of time that this occurred to him. So, in some cases, there may be a making up of memory, right? But in large cases, there will be a real trauma of some type. And even if there is a making up of memory, that will add on to that pre existing thing.
So even if there is a false memory,
Uh,
it is probably been created in order to cover up another trauma.
uh,
Or let's say a fantasy memory,
uh,
fantasy trauma is still there to cover up, to defend, to cope with another deeper trauma. Is that what it is?
uh, uh, that is not how Freud put it, but
Okay.
in most cases, we find it that way. Like for Freud, the original idea was a childhood trauma, and then came the idea of a fantasized trauma. And they were almost like substitutes of each other. Like if you don't have this, you have this. Right? They were almost at equal things in terms of significance. But in practice, what we find is at least the type of patients that I have been seeing or know about, that the fantasized trauma, as you rightly said, is actually a kind of defense against a more deeper difficult trauma. Let me give an example. Let us say the early life more difficult trauma is of abandonment, and uh, the first 2 years of that fantasy life, which is very torturous and brutal. And let us say to cope with that abandonment, the person has developed a histrionic personality disorder. So, and this will bring us to one of my discoveries. Let me not call it discovery, but let me say a theory that I have created of personality disorders. I call it a valley junction model. And the idea there is that most of the personality disorders are actually different ways of coping with the same early life trauma of loss. Now, let us say somebody has histrionic personality disorder, and it's very easy for that person to fantasize a childhood sexual abuse. So if, let us say, somebody creates a false memory of a childhood sexual abuse, now that will actually cover up the more difficult trauma of abandonment and what followed that abandonment. Uh, should we break for a cup of tea for 10 minutes?
Yes, sir.
So it's 3:40. Let us get back at 3:50 and we'll
Yeah.
start from page 40 and we'll
Okay.
complete the whole thing.
Yeah.